Today we have a special with Dr. Sami Al-Arian, who needs no introduction. He is the director of our center. I'm going to skip a lengthy introduction because I'm sure that the people who follow our work know Dr. Sami really well. He is a commentator mostly on the Middle East and American foreign policy and international strategy and geopolitics. Today we're going to jump into kind of giving an analytic overview of what has transpired in the region for the last few months. And also I think it's good to create some context around where we stand now. I want to begin, Dr. Sami, with discussing a certain new narrative that has reappeared as the ceasefire was signed. Well, I don't even know if it was signed. I think it was just
it was back in January, the one that was broken in March.
That a lot of people began to speak about questioning October 7th itself, the decision of the resistance movement in Gaza to launch an offensive against the occupation. And some people have said that after what has transpired in the occupied territories and in Gaza, and then also the larger destabilization that has taken place in the region, that perhaps the resistance miscalculated its offensive on October 7th. How do we situate this, in the broader context of the Middle East?
Thank you, Awais, and thank you everybody for being here today. I think it's very important to distinguish between two questions. The first question is whether or not the decision made on October 7th was rational, and the second, whether or not it was correct decision. I think these are two separate questions. Many people sometimes confuse the two. I've seen lately that even some scholars were questioning what happened on October 7th. And I think the verdict on whether or not it was correct is premature, because these kind of questions would have to be answered when the war or the conflict is over, and you give it some time to see what is the long-term impact of that decision is. But the question of whether or not it was a rational decision, I think, deserves to be answered. I want to take you back to 15 days before October 7th actually took place, particularly on that date, September 22nd, 2023. That's the day when Benjamin Netanyahu stood up before the United Nations, and in his hand there was a map. And he drew a line that started from the Indian Ocean, going through the Arabian Sea, Persian Gulf, then to the United Arab Emirates, from there through Saudi Arabia and Jordan to the port of Haifa, and from there through the Mediterranean to Europe. It was dubbed the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, IMEC. And there was no Palestine in that map. The whole Palestine, the whole territory mandated, British mandated Palestine, was called Israel in that map. And he was touting and he was boasting that this is the map of the future of the Middle East, in which Israel will be basically the most important part that is connecting East and West. Israel is going to be the hegemon of the Middle East. That was the gist of what he was talking about. Meanwhile, we have the Palestinian situation in total chaos. If you look at Gaza, for example, since 2007, Gaza has been under siege, crippling siege, where nothing would go in and out without Israeli permission. So this whole notion that the Israelis gave Gaza independence or they gave them sovereignty is obviously a myth, is a lie, never happened. And even somebody like Sinwar, who became in charge of Gaza as the leader of Hamas since 2017, he tried everything, by the way, in order to break the siege. He called on the Palestinian Authority to come and take over Gaza. He said, I'll give the keys to Abu Mazen, come and rule it if you're able to break the siege. That offer was never taken seriously. They had the Great March of Return, having thousands and thousands of Palestinians going to the border trying to do something. They were met with bullets. Dozens and dozens of Palestinians were killed at that border in order to not have the Palestinians have their voices heard throughout the world to break the siege. We saw international solidarity movements coming and trying to break the siege. The most famous possibly before this time around was Mavi Marmara. 10 people were killed. 9 of them were actually Turks, and 1 was Turkish American. So they tried many things. He offered Israel a 10-year truce in which there is a commitment there will be no attacks and there will be some kind of a truce. They dismissed it. They never took it seriously. He tried with the Arab League, with the international community, nothing. Complete siege on Gaza, in which they call it mowing the lawn. Every few months or a few years, they will come and kill more Palestinians in order to put them, quote unquote, in their place. That was just Gaza. If you look at the West Bank, since the elections of this government, this right-wing government led by Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, Smotrich came 1 month after they were empowered. They took control in December 2022. In January 2023, he gave a speech. That speech was repeated many times, including once in France, in which he said, Palestinians basically have 3 options. One is to recognize, acknowledge that this is a state for the Jews. The Palestinians will have no political rights, no civil rights. They are there as our guests. Basically, they will be serving us. If they accept that status, then we will see how many we can have. If not, and he said, I understand that, they get compensation and they will leave. And the third option, if they refuse these 2, is death. This is what he was telling all the time, every audience that he was talking to. Meanwhile, his partner, Ben-Gvir, of course, Smotrich became the Minister of Finance. He had dual positions, Minister of Finance, and the minister within the Defense Ministry in charge of the West Bank. And his program, in which also he said it openly, is that he said, we're now about 800,000. Of course, they don't count the settlers in Jerusalem, Greater Jerusalem. It's about 250,000. It's over 500,000. But in total, 800,000. He said, within my tenure, the next few years, we'll reach 1 million, and then we're on to 2 million. And he was also talking about annexing Area C in the West Bank. As you know from Oslo, the West Bank is divided into 3 areas. One area, Area A, where the majority of the Palestinians live, in the major metropolitan areas. That's about 22% of the area of the West Bank. West Bank is about 5,500 kilometers square. And this is where Abbas is. So administratively and security, it's supposed to be under the Palestinian Authority, where the Israeli forces will be outside the cities. But that's only a small portion. That's Area A. Area B is where you have the villages. That's about 18% of the land. Area A has about 80% of the Palestinians. Area B, about 15% of the Palestinians. Area C, which is about 60% of the land, has about 5% of the Palestinians. His program is to depopulate these 5%, push them out, and annex the 60%. A lot of it also have Israeli settlements. And he was talking about this openly. Meanwhile, his partner, Ben-Gvir, started arming the settlers because he became the Minister of National Police in charge of the settlers inside and the settlement. And he started arming them. 150,000 people were armed, and they were starting basically their harassment program against the Palestinians, particularly in these 60%. He was also in charge of the prisoners. Palestinians have gained many, I wouldn't call them rights or privileges, but many things that they were able to get through their struggle for decades in the prisons, including right to education, visitation from family, canteen, cooking, praying together. All these things, phone calls, they were taken away by Ben-Gvir. So they were under tremendous pressure, and they were putting pressure on the leadership of Hamas and Gaza. Do something about this. We can't. These are people who have been there for decades, and they expect also to be there for decades. So that's a fourth reason. So you have Gaza, you have West Bank, where people under tremendous pressure to depopulate, to annex, to make it unlivable. There are over 1,000 checkpoints in the West Bank. If you are a professor, if you're in Nablus and a professor, in Birzeit or something, and or let's say in Ramallah, it's supposed to take you 10 minutes, it takes you 2 hours, because you have to go around all these checkpoints in order to arrive there. They have roads for Jews only. That's why it's called the apartheid regime. There are roads that are only for Israelis and Jews, while the Palestinians are unallowed.
Before you continue, how many, at this stage in 2023, before October 7th, how many Palestinians were imprisoned by the Israeli regime?
There are about 6,000 by that time, 1,800 of which were under administrative detention, meaning they've never been tried. They have been arrested, put in administrative detention. You're supposed to be there 6 months without trial, and you're supposed to be released. So what they do, they release them for 1 hour, and then they arrest them again, and they put them for another 6 months. So
these people who are detained, they are detained obviously without any due process. There's no, because there's been a debate in the media regarding the word hostage, right?
Yeah.
And what does that really mean in terms of law?
You're absolutely right. Palestinians are their hostage. Obviously, there are security detainees. These are people who have been arrested, they have been tortured, they have maybe extracted certain confessions, they've been tried, and of course, no one else gets tried in an Israeli court and gets a fair trial. And then they will be sentenced. Many of them, at least 400 or so, are sentenced to life in prison. Then you have the administrative detentions, which is a tactic they use against many Palestinians to arrest them and teach them a lesson so that they will never think about resistance. It's estimated since 1967, there have been at least 1 million Palestinians that have gone into that jail system, that detention system. Almost 50% of the youth.
And these are used as bargaining chips with the resistance, isn't it?
They are used as a pressure tactic to make sure that the spirit of resistance would be under control.
I see.
So you have the West Bank with the plan to depopulate, to annex, and to make life miserable, because the idea is to depopulate people. You have the issue of the prisoners, the issue of Gaza. The fourth is Jerusalem. Now, the one in charge of Jerusalem was also Ben Gvir, in which he started this process of incursion. He would bring settlers. It was at the beginning every month or so, and then became more frequent. About every week or so, they will go and bring hundreds of settlers, with the aim being that they want to impose what they call the division in time and space. It's the same tactic they used in Masjid al-Ibrahimi in Hebron 2 decades before. About 3 decades ago, in the mid-90s. They claim that this is the mosque of Prophet Ibrahim, therefore they have stake in it.
Yeah.
So they start, it was completely, I visited that in 1983. There was basically 1 hour a week in which Jews would be permitted to go. But from that moment on, from mid-90s, they say they want it daily. Now it's the opposite. Now it's the Muslims that will have only 15 minutes for every prayer, and then they have to evacuate, and it's totally occupied by whatever, Israeli and Jews. They are in possession of it. So they want to do the same with Al-Aqsa. They want to said, we have a stake there, that this Dome of the Rock is where our 2 temples were. So we need to get time every day, and we need a certain area, and then a bit they start annexing it until eventually it will be the reverse. And of course, they talk every day about to build the 3rd temple and to slaughter the Haifas and so on and so forth, the red Haifas. So that was also going on. And if you remember back in 2021, that's why we had war in 2021. It's because they were trying to impose this. But perhaps the most important strategic one, the 5th reason, has to do with what was awaiting the region. And that's, I go back to what I started with, which is the speech by Netanyahu in the United Nations. The United States, for almost 3 decades, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, and they became the unipolar around the world, because they were the superpower, no one else was there, just to give you by way of example, in 1992, the GDP of China was only 7% of the US. So it wasn't near any way to threaten the status of the US. Russia was in total chaos with Yeltsin. So they were there, and when you're that strong, you can afford to make mistakes. So they pursued three strategies, and
This is the Americans or the Israelis?
The Americans. Mm-hmm. Americans. So they pursued a strategy for China, because we have to go back and try to figure out what are the most important regions that matter for the US. It is a region where there could be a potential competitor, mm-hmm. or a region where it has so much wealth, if it falls in the competitor's influence, it will impact American policy. Mm-hmm. So they would have it in charge. So this is why they have these three regions which matter. Europe, since World War II, because the Soviet Union, and then the potential of Russia, because it has nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. China, before that was Japan, of course. But China could also become a competitor. And the Middle East, or particularly the Persian Gulf, because this is where the oil is. And oil is the most important commodity. Since 1971, the dollar was tied to the petrodollar, mm-hmm. because they delinked the dollar from the gold. And therefore, they have to be in charge of this region, mm-hmm. in order to control the oil. So it will not be in anybody's hands. And they can control the wealth. So any excess wealth from the selling of this most important commodity in the world, it will be reinvested or re-given to the Americans, but also because of Israel since 1967. So that's roughly what it is. They pursued three strategies. All of them backfired. All of them failed. They pursued a strategy of integrating China into the World Trade System, particularly World Trade Organization, thinking that when China becomes rich, its political system will become a liberal or neoliberal one, and it becomes under the control of the US. They never contemplated that you can have an authoritarian system with a strong economy. That didn't. They only woke up to this fact too late in 2015, 2016, towards the end of Obama's second term, and that's when they started dealing with it. That they have to shift now to the east before even surpasses the US. They pursued a policy of the color revolutions in order to change all these regimes, integrate with NATO, eventually reaching Russia, hoping to get another color revolution. It becomes, and then they change the system. And of course, for many years, Russia was too weak, so they were expanding NATO, even though they promised Gorbachev that not 1 inch further than Germany. Uh-huh. Of course, that was a lie. NATO was 16 members. It reached 28 by the time it was very clear to the Russians when they took a decision in 2008 that they want to integrate Ukraine and Georgia. And that's when Putin basically put his foot down, and they had the wars and warning and so on and so forth. They continued that until we reached 2022 with the Ukraine war. This was, as many experts, including Mearsheimer, would tell you that this was a war, or this was a confrontation that the West was seeking, was pushing. So that, I mean,
it's very clear that in East Asia, you have a very large power like China, and you have the experience of the Soviet Union and Russia. But besides control of oil commodities, why particularly is the Middle East,
I want to explain that actually.
A linchpin.
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Foreign policy.
Because that takes us to the third region.
Because there's no large power in this region.
Right. So that takes us to the third region. Yes, the first two, they have a potential China, potential Russia, so we need to control them. Why? Because if these countries become hegemons in their own region, they can go outside the region and challenge the US. Yeah. That's the theory.
Of course, yeah.
And they wouldn't allow them to be hegemon or to be or to feel comfortable in their own region. Yes. So the strategy is you create balancing, what they call balancing, other alliances and other forces. But this region is very important for two reasons. Mm-hmm. One is oil, because if they can control the oil, that means they can, and most of that oil goes to China. A lot of that oil goes to China. Then they will be choking hold on China. If China misbehaves, they can cut off that oil. Then China will have difficulty fueling its economy, but also because of the wealth. This is very important commodity that it needs to be controlled by the U.S. because this is basically where they can control the needs of big industrial countries, but also because of Israel. Israel, since 1967, was integrated into the empire or the military strategy of the U.S., particularly in this region. And of course, this took a long time before it was integrated militarily within the region. The U.S. controls the world through 7 military commands. This region is controlled through what is called CENTCOMMAND, not Turkey, but basically 20 countries, starting from Egypt to Afghanistan. And Israel, because it was always an antagonistic power, it was always part of NATO, but undeclared.
Yeah, as a
associate member. But then since 2020, when Trump integrated it into CENTCOM, it became part and parcel. And that's when they decided that this region, we want to pivot to Asia. We have lots of bases in this region, about 63, at least 63 bases that go through almost a dozen countries, that they want to outsource the protection of American interest to Saudi Arabia and Israel. To do that, they wanted a normalization deal. That was what was awaiting.
But here, when we say Saudi Arabia, it's a bit strange because Saudi Arabia doesn't have the experience or even the capability to be a regional hegemon, like the way Israel has tried and has tested, right?
The U.S. is not interested in regional hegemons. It's interested in powers in which they can preserve and protect the U.S. interest. It's not trying to build up a Saudi hegemon power. That's not what they're trying to do. They're trying to make use of the Saudi position, but also the fact that Saudi Arabia is the most important country that has not normalized being the birthplace of Islam, but also of its tremendous wealth.
Wealth, yeah.
So, and by the way, this is not a new policy. Back in 1971, when the Americans were deeply involved in the Vietnam War, Nixon at the time announced what he called the twin pillar policy.
The twin pillars.
He said at the time that this is about empowering local regimes to preserve a Western interest, and he named Iran and Saudi Arabia. But he was not truthful, because Saudi Arabia was not powerful enough to do that. It was actually Iran and Israel.
That's why I was saying it's strange to bank your policy on Saudi Arabia, which doesn't have a large enough. I mean, I don't think it has a large enough military to be able to manage the population of this region. I mean,
it doesn't. But it has enough military hardware. Saudi Arabia was the biggest purchaser of American weapons a few years ago, $90 billion in 1 year. This year, he went to Saudi Arabia and they announced like $350-something billion. So Saudi Arabia is capable of having this kind of wealth.
I see.
They have many American bases there. But at the time, I just want to go back to Nixon, 1971, the evidence that it wasn't meant to be Saudi Arabia, we can see that when there was a fight, when there was a confrontation between the Palestinian factions and the Jordanian regime. And Israel was afraid, and the Americans were afraid that the Palestinians may actually prevail. And at the time, Syria moved its forces to be on the side at the border.
This is 71?
This is 70.
Oh, 70,
this is September 70. They were there, and they were about to enter on the side of the Palestinians. So who deterred them? Was it Saudi Arabia? Was Israel? Israel said, if you cross the border, we'll bomb you. We'll strike at you. So they did it, the Syrians.
So Israel came to protect the Jordanian.
Of course. If it wasn't for the Israelis, the Jordanian regime would have collapsed. Absolutely. That tells you who had the military hardware and the military potential to deter or to at least preserve the U.S. or its
and
allies.
Safeguard these lines.
Right. I just want to finish the first question, so very quickly. So now, China being a threat as a competitor, so the United States wanted to reposition itself in this region, and it wanted to again outsource this region to Saudi Arabia and Israel. And that's what, but this would have been at the expense of the Palestinians. And this would have been done in the spring of 2024. It's very important to understand that. October 7th happened in October 2023. By the spring of 2024, there would have been a normalization deal. Saudi Arabia would have been part of the Abraham Accords. There was a lot of pressure on Pakistan and Indonesia to follow suit.
Bob Woodward has reported this in
Yes.
his, about the ongoing conversations with Saudi Arabia. I think Lindsey Graham was involved in going shuttling back and forth between Washington and Riyadh.
Right. And Brett McCormick was the one engineering this whole thing. So when you look at these 5 reasons, then it makes a lot of, this was a rational decision. You're going to do something in order to stop the deterioration, the siege on Gaza, the settlements, the deterioration of the treatment of the prisoners, what's happening in Jerusalem, and strategically what's happening here.
This was reaching a kind of boiling point, you're saying?
Absolutely.
A tipping point.
And you have been, I mean, in terms of Hamas and the resistance, they have been preparing for a situation where when things got to the bottom, that they could actually mount a resistance or a battle in which they can really bloody the Israelis to the point where they can change the conditions. And I think that's what they felt that. Now, what happened, what transpired after that, obviously needs careful examination.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of issues that, also the failure of the Muslim world's response that probably was in the calculation of the resistance. And there's also the larger plans of Israel, like you mentioned, the Abraham Accords. I mean, frustrating these plans is also a form of strategic resistance. I mean, making sure that the costs of normalization go from being something that's implicit, happening behind closed doors, to make it explicit, show that the real price to pay for normalization is the Palestinian cause. It was in 2023, before October 7th, we were quickly moving towards a situation where the Palestinian cause was almost off the table.
That's right. And you have to add to that also that they tried this as a rehearsal in 2021, and the reaction of the Muslim world, of the Palestinians in the 1948 areas, of the West Bankers, as well as what is called the axis of resistance, was very encouraging, where they, in their calculation, I believe, they thought, okay, we're going to have such an awakening, a course where things could really go in a direction that can change things on the ground. It would have been very difficult to contemplate what actually transpired. That the Israelis, the Arab living in the 1948 areas, they would be under tremendous pressure not to act because of the brutality of the Israeli response. What's happening in the West Bank, not only that they have been very aggressive, willing to kill and without any consequences, but also the betrayal and the complicity of the Palestinian Authority being part and parcel, working for the Israelis as collaborators against their own people.
I want to take a little moment of clarification there. Recently, a lot of people have argued that, Netanyahu funded Hamas. This has, when you speak about, who's collaborating with who, one of the things that you come across in the news is that, especially because of Netanyahu's corruption trials, which he is now facing in Israel, that he was the one who funded Hamas.
Well, obviously, his detractors and his enemies, political enemies inside the Israeli regime, would like to say that. But Netanyahu had a theory. First of all, Netanyahu is an extremist. What he wants to do, he does not want to see any kind of a Palestinian entity.
Yeah.
And he hates any kind of resistance, and he fights them, but he also does not want the Palestinian Authority. He wants collaborators. He doesn't want to see any kind of a Palestinian sovereignty, or even a Palestinian entity, even pseudo-sovereignty. So one way to do this is to make sure that that separation would exist between the West Bank and Gaza, in which he can claim that there is no voice, one particular Palestinian authority, and here you have Hamas. And of course, Hamas didn't come out of nowhere. It
wasn't a brainchild of Netanyahu or
no,
anything like
not
that.
all. I mean, the resistance started in its current form, started in the 80s.
Yeah.
Right after 1982 invasion, and then it accelerated after the first Intifada in 87 and came through different phases. And after the Palestinian Authority, which was the PLO at the time, and its different factions, including Fatah, became part of this political process called Oslo, which is extremely failed process. It became the Palestinian Islamic resistance movements, basically through Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, that became the face of resistance, because the other parties just took a back seat.
I see.
But of course, that failed very quickly because the Oslo did not bring Palestinians any kind of achievements, any kind of relief. But when you go back and try to examine this whole process of, did Netanyahu fund Hamas? Well, he didn't want the Palestinian Authority to be in control of Gaza. There was a pressure by the George W. Bush administration to have elections. Condoleezza Rice talks about that in her memoir with details, in which their polling, their expectation, their experts said that Fatah will win, and therefore they can impose their political settlement on the Palestinians.
I see.
They never contemplated that Hamas would win. They thought maybe between 30 and 40%.
I remember that, yeah.
And she actually, in her memoir, she was on the, she was working out, I think in the elliptical or something, and then she saw this and said, "They can't be right. That's not what we know." I mean, she immediately didn't believe what she was saying. And of course, once Hamas became the ruling party, that changed everything. That wasn't a.
So I think the key thing is that they didn't really care about the Palestinian Authority or Hamas. They wanted it to be. They wanted the Palestinian resistance to be separated, to be fractured. That's
well, the Bush administration wanted the Abbas Palestinian Authority to be in charge of the whole thing and impose a political settlement on them.
I see.
Now Hamas won 2006. So between 2006 and 2007, they had their own prime minister and government. And of course, they were always pressuring Abbas to have a conflict with them because they didn't like that. So they tried to impose some conditions on Hamas, recognitions of Israel, giving up your arms and all that. They said no. And Blair was going back and forth.
That's what.
So they tried to, and then when they tried to have a coup against Hamas, and there's a full story in the Vanity Fair. Those who are interested, they can read. And this was taken at the highest levels of the U.S. government, at the National Security Council.
Really?
Absolutely.
The coup against Hamas in Gaza
and not only that,
was planned in D.C.
In D.C., and it says, in that Vanity Fair article, which was not disputed, Bush is asking who will lead this. Then she mentions Mohammed Dahlan, and he does not recognize the name. And then when she starts describing him, he says, "Oh, he's our bitch." I mean, that's the kind of language he was using. And then they decide to fund it with $30 million. Who pays for that? He said the Emiratis are willing to pay for that.
I see.
So they pay the
that's why he went to
he had that
the Emirates afterwards.
I mean, the whole thing is the Vanity Fair article, as I said, with full details about that coup failed. So basically what Hamas, we have an Arab saying, it says, you have lunch with him before they have you for dinner. So that's what happened. The Hamas had them for lunch before they would have had Hamas. Because he kept saying, "I'm not ready, give me a few weeks." And they kept pushing him. But Hamas people knew, so they took over and then they had the complete siege. That's when the siege started.
Dr. Sami, I want to...
But I want to just finish this thought very quickly. So about funding Hamas. So 2009, Netanyahu comes. He was not in government.
2009.
So this is 2 years in. And he found this is an opportunity for him to deepen the schism, the separation. So it's not funding Hamas. It's taking advantage of the situation to make sure that Hamas will stay in power. That doesn't mean that he's funding them.
Because this is a movement that came from the 80s. I mean, this is
Of course. I mean, they killed most of... I mean, if you look at how many people they assassinated throughout the years, all the leaders of Hamas. In 2000, and with all governments. In 2004, even the founder, Ahmed Yassin, was assassinated.
Yes.
His replacement, Abdulaziz Rantisi, was assassinated. Back in 96, the one who's in charge of the military wing, was assassinated. So, I mean, all of them were. dozens and dozens of people. So to me, he's empowering them. Of course not.
Of course
But
not.
what happened in the later years, they said they wanted to sustain Hamas without empowering it or lifting the siege.
I see.
So they had an agreement with Qatar. Qatar will pay about roughly to the tune, I think, of something, if I remember correctly, like $10 million a month or something like that. Enough Palestinians at $100 for poor families, but these will be vetted. None of them will have any connection with Hamas, and Israel would approve them one by one. They will. So that meant you are infusing the Gaza economy with about $10 million. That will keep them afloat, but not enough. But Hamas and the resistance, they started a program of actually empowering themselves by having this tunnel cities, by getting the technology to manufacture their own weapons, because they know if they don't have that power, at one point they will be taken out.
And that is also the spirit of resistance, right?
Yes.
To make sure that you are able to defend your population and try to do your best to try to protect the people that you are meant to serve. It shows the seriousness and commitment of the Hamas government for
Right,
the interests of the Palestinian people.
Also takes us back to your question about how they were pursuing this. So after they were empowering themselves, and much of that empowerment, whether people like it or not, came through Iranian technology and Iranian know-how.
Can you tell us more about that? I mean, how did the Iranians actually help Hamas?
Since the 1979 revolution, Iran was very clear. I mean, the first decision that Khomeini did in 1979 was, the first decision was to throw out the Israeli ambassador and hand over the Israeli embassy to Yasser Arafat. Their commitment to Palestine was there. I mean, people could disagree about Iran policy in any other spheres, but when it comes to Palestine, it's very clear. It's the only country that is willing to say publicly, not only that they support Palestinians, but they willing to fund them, arm them, give them technology that they need to resist, and that's in the open. They talk about it, the resistance talks about it, the Israelis talk about it. They bombed many shipments that they were going there, particularly in Sudan.
This is a key point, because as you know, those who are opposed to October 7th, and this is the topic at hand, they argue that, Iran may be willing to support the Palestinian cause in terms of violence, in terms of arms. However, what really is required in this region is prosperity, like economic development. And that requires, money, and it requires economy and growth of investments. And this will not happen if there's a resistance on the ground. So,
But I don't know of any,
how do you analyze
I don't know
that
of any
argument?
situation where you can have prosperity if you're not independent. That means whoever is occupying you, colonizing you, they will call the shots. And they will never call the shots for your own interest. So they will just try to control you through other means. And a good example of this is what's happening in the West Bank. So what happened in the West Bank now that they have this economic prosperity?
Yeah.
So they gave, and this was part of General Dayton's plan. Dayton was an American general who came in 2005 after the Second Intifada with the aim of trying to pacify the West Bank. And to do that, they started training new Palestinian forces that would be brand new so that they would not be poisoned with any thoughts of resistance. And they will be under the American training program and the Jordanian, and then they will be given their salaries directly from the American aid. American aid is only for security. They don't support Palestinians.
USAID.
USA, yes.
Yeah.
And then by doing that, they will be able to create this new generation of Palestinians in which they will be directly related to this colonization. Now, if you go back to the notion of how the Israelis are maintaining control, it's through that. So they create this collaborators, this PA authority. They call it security coordination. So when you talk about American prosperity or economic prosperity, so they go and give Palestinians loans. This is how you This is how you control resistance. So you give them this false notion of prosperity. You want a car, you want to buy a house, you
Yeah.
want to have a comfortable life.
Yeah, of
So we
course.
give you loans. You have about 60, 70,000 people within this structure of security. You have almost the same number or more, like 100,000 are civil servants. So you give them loans. Now, all what they have to do is to work and be
Yeah.
quiet.
You get
so
a
that you
phone.
can pay your mortgage.
Kids can go to school.
Exactly. So this is how they pacify it. So when you talk about economic prosperity, it's not about to become economically dependable, independent. It's about how to become dependent on them so that they can basically implement their plans on you. And Israelis are not hiding what their plans are. Their plans is to have greater Israel with as few Palestinians in the land as possible, to make life miserable for them so that when they leave, they never come back. Any Palestinian who leaves, by the way, for a number of years, they lose residency. If you get, let's say, if you are a Palestinian student who went to the United States for education, if you are from Jerusalem and you go there for 3 years, don't come back, you lose your residency. If you go there from the West Bank and if you get citizenship, immediately you lose your residency. So that's a type of pressure they apply. So when you talk about as if Iran was supposed to fund Palestinian prosperity so that the colonizer have it an easy way, is that what it is? It's the only country, again, for your question, it's the only country that was willing at the time to support resistance. Resistance meaning that you want to become independent, you want to get rid of the occupation, the invaders, and they were vocal about it and open about it. And it's even if the whole world recognizes Israel, we're not going to recognize Israel. We think this is fundamentally wrong. Now, people could agree or disagree with that. That is there. And of course, people were actually casting doubt that this is for a larger Iranian grand plan or grand strategy. Well, we saw what happened, just in the past few weeks.
Yeah, I think we should move to the conversation towards trying to understand. Obviously, I'll let you transition into this, but how have the facts on the ground changed now in terms of the geopolitical puzzle that is Western Asia at the moment?
Very well. Before we get into that, let's recognize that Iran itself had a grand strategy, what Vali Nasser in his new book calls forward defense.
Forward defense, yes.
And that comes from the experience that Iran had during the Iran-Iraq war. For 8 years, they were under tremendous pressure. The whole world was on side of Iraq, and they were trying basically to dismantle the regime. And they had this 8-year war, and they were trying to overcome, and they couldn't. Eventually, we had basically a stalemate. And they recognized they lost almost 500,000 people in that fight. That what they want to do is to have proxies or to have allies throughout the region. They cannot ignore the fact that the Arabs, according to him, they could threaten them. Today was Saddam Hussein, tomorrow could be something else. So they needed to have presence. And of course, they were able to build that presence, but most of that presence came also as their strategy to encircle Israel as well. So it was dual purpose. Of course, the most important party was Hezbollah in Lebanon. And of course, that went through 18 years of vicious resistance that ended with the Israeli withdrawal in 2000, and they built up a very formidable resistance movement in their support of the Palestinian factions, Hamas and Jihad primarily in Palestine, and their relationship with Syria as a regime that was opposed to Israel, regardless of how it was treating its citizens. That's a different question, but it was part of that axis of resistance, although it was the weakest link in that resistance, and recently with Yemen and Iraq. So they built this forward base, and it was very difficult then to attack Iran when these forces are strong enough that they can hurt not only American interests in the Middle East, but they can directly threaten Israel. October 7th changed all that.
I want to get into that. Why is normalization, Trump has showed these, I I think there's also some AI images of some kind of like beach resorts in Gaza. And also there's messaging out of the GCC. Normalize, normalization is the path to prosperity. Uh, why resist and create all of this, as they say, disturbance and destabilization in the region? Be like Turkey, normalize, with Western powers and integrate into the world economy like all other normal countries. Um, why would that not lead to five-star resorts?
Well, let's take Egypt as an example. Egypt signed in 1979
Yes.
Camp David Accords, then the peace treaty in March, on March 26, 1979. I remember that's the year I got married. So the dollar was 70 piastres. That's
And
point
it
0.7,
matters a lot what the dollar is the year
point
you get
0.7,
married.
0.7 pound, 0.7 Egyptian pound. Today is 50. That's 70 times. What is the prosperity here? They were telling us at the time that once we normalize with Israel, sign a peace treaty, this will be the end of all wars, end of all wars in the Middle East.
Yes.
And they will be able to have the land of milk and honey, and everybody's going to own a car and have a house, and
Yes.
the beauty. What is Egypt today? And did Israel actually stop wars? Israel withdrew from Sinai on April 15th. By June 6th, less than 6 weeks later, it was invading Lebanon, trying to impose its political will. And it has been fighting the whole thing since then. The whole point of the Camp David Accord was to take Egypt off that, group of enemies, because that would give Israel basically the upper hand. If there was any fear, existential fear in Israel throughout the conflict up until that time, was that if Egypt has its act together, it can really hurt. Today, Iran obviously is much stronger than Egypt ever was, but it is far, far, because it's thousands of kilometers away. But still, it can hurt Israel pretty badly. So they recognize this, and of course, anytime they look at, you talked about Israel, in Israel's military doctrine, it's very important for them that they are stronger than all their enemies combined, that they can hit all of them and can win a war. They can't afford to lose a war, and they can do that with the shortest time possible. But which is they call decisive action. And the most important principle is deterrence. So they built this arsenal in which everybody would be afraid. So what October 7th did is that they shook up that deterrence doctrine. If the resistance was not deterred, for the first time in the history of the conflict, they are hit inside what they consider their own territories. In 1973, yes, there was surprise attack by Egypt and Syria, but it was in Syrian soil and Egyptian soil. This is the first time they hit in their own military bases, in their own settlements. That never happened before. So this was really, it really shook them up.
Yeah, right now, with the help of American military in the region, Americans are essentially, if we take the lifting of Syrian sanctions yesterday, giving a message, right? They're giving a message that, quiet cooperation will, will benefit yourself and your population. And the neck of resistance, they are, like you said, what happened on October 7th was an act of defiance against a siege, and it lifted the head of maybe a possibility of a different Middle East. But then, and I think that is more dangerous to both Israel and American security interests than what's actually happening. The fact that people see for the first time the vulnerability of all of these myths that have been put in people's heads, that perhaps we could have a future where the Palestinian people are free. Perhaps we could have a future where we have sovereign, independent Muslim states in the region. And this idea has to be subdued, pacified, you know, eliminated from the options that people see in the future. And instead, weak, docile regimes that cooperate with both Israeli and American interests for the future of, you know, their children and their prosperity is what is that, am I hearing
Yes,
you
yes,
correctly about
that's
that?
actually what happened, is that October 7th actually shook up Israeli society. The whole notion of deterrence, which is one of the most important principles of their military doctrine,
Yes.
has been undermined. So they needed to restore that. And to restore that, they embarked on genocide, you know, which is very difficult to, because the history of genocide, yes, there was genocide in 1948. It stayed for a few months, where almost 80% of the Palestinians were expelled from the areas that they occupied in 1948. But there were no cameras. It happened, you know, relatively quickly, and the Palestinians were not fighting back. You know,
Yeah, there was no resistance.
but
There
mostly it was
yeah,
mass expulsion.
expulsion. Yeah.
But here it's different. It's being broadcast live in a very small area, 365 kilometers square. Thousands of people being killed.
With
So-
fortifications, with
Yes.
defenses. There's defenses. There's the underground tunnel network.
Yes.
And tunnel
But
warfare.
that's for fighters, but Palestinians are not protected.
Of course, yes.
70% women and children. I'll tell you also a story that's very important for people to know. What happened October 7th is that in 1949, between January and July, there was a series of truce that was taking place between different countries. Started with Egypt in January 1949 and ended with Lebanon and Syria, and it ended with Syria in July 1949. The area of Gaza, in which there was a truce between the Egyptian side and the Israeli side, by January 1949, when they signed a truce, was 565 kilometers square. Today it's 365. So what happened with these 200? What happened to them? So what happened is that the Palestinians who were expelled to Gaza, Gaza population was about 150. There were about 300,000 who were refugees.
Who came in from the surrounding region.
My parents and grandparents were among these. So most of these Palestinians, at night, they will go to their villages, to their house, because they can walk. There are no fences, there are no fortifications. It was easy just to walk from there. You go to your own field, go to your own house. You can go, and in the middle, you might see some Israelis, and you may fight them, you may kill them, you may injure them, you may take their cattle, you may do some form of resistance. So what do? The Israelis, the next day, they go and take revenge with the Egyptian army. And this became so intolerable that the governor of Gaza at the time was an Egyptian general, Egyptian officer, had an agreement with the Israelis.
He made an agreement.
Made an agreement in February 1950. It's called Al-Arian agreement. This is actually registered in the United Nations with full maps, in which they made 200 kilometers as a buffer zone. Palestinians cannot go through that, so they have to stop there. So this would be an empty land until they figure out what they're going to do.
A no man's land.
What do the Israelis do? Just take it and annex it. Now it's interesting that this land, this 200 kilometers, is where the fight took place on October 7th. All the settlements, all the military bases, they were there on this part of land, what they call the periphery of Gaza. This land was Palestinian land, or at least Arab land, under Egyptian authority after the truce, after the establishment of the state. So this is actually not just Palestinian land. This
has not been reported anywhere. I mean, people
ignore it.
Yeah, because
but you can go to United Nations website and put Al-Arian agreement. That map will come. You can read it because it's in English.
And it marks the territory, the buffer zone.
It will give complete coordinates and maps of it. This is Gaza. This is buffer zone. This is Israel, and you could see it as a square. That square is where all the periphery of Gaza, yes, and that's where all the settlements that took place on October 7th. So even the Palestinians, if they think, okay, forget about the state, we're just trying to regain what we had there, they have every legitimate right. But this is the situation.
I want to, because we're coming up against.
I want to talk also maybe about the latest Israeli plans. Yeah.
Let's get there, and I also want to talk about other powers'
Maybe we can
interests.
get some people here.
And we don't, and we also want to keep some room for discussion. So, can we now? We've talked about October 7th and the background of October 7th, and also demystified some of the misinformation that has been spoken about in the coverage of these events. What do you think Israel and its partners in the region are planning for the region in the coming years? And maybe you can speak a few words about that. And I want to get to the failure of the Muslim response.
Very briefly, what Israel wants, it wants, particularly this government, it wants to establish Greater Israel. And to establish,
Right now.
Right. This is, they think they have an opportunity, what they missed to do in 1948, which is to expel as many Palestinians from the mandated Palestine. Because today, Israel has a problem. That problem is they cannot establish Greater Israel while the number of Palestinians inside historical Palestine today is more than Israelis, is more than Jews. Today you have 7.2 million Palestinians versus 7.1 million Jews.
So why not continue a slow strategy of settlement and expansion and, small
They were
cutting
doing
the
that
grass?
until they found now a historic opportunity that
What makes it so historic now?
because they can get away with the genocide.
I see.
They can see now that they can kill with impunity. No one is doing anything about it.
And also the greater weakness in the region.
And if it succeeds in Gaza, then they can do it in the West Bank and get it over with. Particularly with this government. I'm not saying that every Israeli general or every Israeli politician is along with that, but those who are in charge of Israel today, they think this is an unbelievable opportunity that they shouldn't be missed, and they don't care about public opinion.
Isn't the Iranian nuclear issue a distraction then for this?
No, it's actually for them. Okay, let's get back a bit here. So if you are an Israeli and you want to become the hegemon in the region,
Yeah.
so you're looking at every other regime and they are submitting basically. They're willing to work with you. They're willing to say and acknowledge you're the hegemon, but you have to take care of our interests. You say, okay, I'll take care of your interests. But there is a problem. That problem is Iran, because Iran is not submitting, and its allies. Mm-hmm. So now you get this opportunity. You go through genocide. So you're gonna, I'm gonna pacify and neutralize and end Hamas, and Jihad, and Hezbollah, and eventually Ansarullah in Yemen, and Al-Hashd in Iraq. I'm going to change the regime in Syria, and then I'm going to go after Iran. This plan, by the way, was the same plan they had that Wesley Clark talked about in 2001.
Yes.
These 7 countries, but because they didn't succeed in Iraq, they couldn't move
It delayed the plan, yeah.
So you go and commit genocide.
The new Middle East or something, right? That's what it was called. Yeah.
You commit genocide, then you go, obviously you've been preparing for with Hezbollah since 2006. So this is where they get their tactical advantage in terms of intelligence. They were able to go and really hurt Hezbollah, with their pager and their others. They didn't defeat Hezbollah, we should acknowledge that, but certainly there's a huge setback there. So they felt very good about that they were able, obviously, to destroy Gaza. So it serves 2 purposes, to pacify the resistance, but they haven't been able to declare total or absolute victory as they want, because they are still there. Resistance is still there, still standing up, still they have their captives, still it's fighting back, it's hurting their people. We can talk also about
also the goals haven't been reached.
We can talk about their strategic losses, which is very important, by the way, because we cannot look at part of the cup that this is half empty. There is huge strategic losses that Israel has suffered from that we could have waited dozens of years or paid millions of dollars and not achieved on all spheres.
Yeah.
We can talk about that too. This is very important because what's happening in the West today, and the West is a great source of strength. The whole narrative of Israel has been devastated.
Has been shattered.
Yeah,
yes.
Completely. So going back now to the issue of the achievement of the resistance itself inside, and their attempt to devastate the resistance movements, Hezbollah and Iran. So Iran became as the latest power If they get rid of it, then they have complete hegemony. They can be the hegemon. There is no one else. And you have to understand that the Israeli military doctrine has changed. In the past, they were looking at intentions. So they have these intelligence services in which, okay, you may have some capabilities, but as long as you are with us, you are working with us.
Yeah. You don't have an intention to harm.
Now they go after capabilities.
They want to eliminate capabilities.
Absolutely. So had Iran been defeated, they would have gone after Turkey, Egypt, even if they are not in state of hostilities.
Because they have potential.
They have the capabilities, and Pakistan too. So Iran became very
key in
alluring,
this,
target if we can get it. And they have been preparing against Iran also in terms of intelligence. What happened on June 13th was not trying to hurt the nuclear facilities or the nuclear capabilities of Iran. It was a full-fledged attack for regime change. They were after the leadership, political and military leadership, and it was staged from inside Iran. They have been preparing for this moment along with the Americans and Europeans for many, many years. They've been training for this. They have trained many Iranian dissidents as well as other agents inside Iran. That failed. That's what's not being reported.
And it's a big loss because you could imagine how much intelligence was used in trying to execute a plan of regime change. This was probably, in their estimation, going to be successful. And the fact that it wasn't successful means that now they have to build up a whole new network of informants, a whole new network. That sets them back many, many years.
They have caught hundreds and hundreds of agents and of collaborators inside the country. But that's when they changed plans to make it about nuclear. Obviously, they don't want Iran to possess nuclear power. But the whole thing was regime change, because if you are able to change the regime in Iran, then everything else will fall. You will not have any kind of a nuclear power. You're not going to have any kind of missile program. But what happened is the Iranians, throughout this time, they were preparing for this moment as well. So they developed maybe one of the most sophisticated missile program in the world.
Yeah, we saw
supersonic, and the damage that they inflicted on Israel is unbelievable. For the first time in the history of the conflict, in 77 years, you're able to hit deep into Israel. That never happened before. Only once, during the 1991 Gulf War, when Saddam hit them with 39 Scud missiles, which were very, very, primitive, didn't do much damage. But here you have very sophisticated missiles that was controlled and accurate, with pinpoint accuracy to most devastating targets, including military intelligence, military bases, industry, refineries, ports, labs. The most sophisticated lab, which goes on since the 1940s. It's called the Weizmann Scientific Lab. Completely devastated. I mean, one of the researchers said, I lost 40 years of research. They never contemplated that they can be. The military headquarters, Air Force bases, the Defense Ministry, the intelligence headquarters, all of them were hit. Now, you have to understand the sophistication of this. When a missile leaves Iran, their first line of defense is the American bases in Iraq. They have dozens of them. They will come, missiles and interceptions. If they pass that, or if they come through a different coordinate, the ones in the Emirates will start, including French technicians and French pilots. If that passes, the next one would be the Jordanian airspace, in which Jordanian and British, they will be there trying to intercept these. Now, if they go a supersonic up to 2,000 kilometers in space, then they have the THAAD system, the American THAAD system, which can get them at that height. If they don't get them and they come to about 1,500, 1,400 kilometers, then they have the Arrow 2 system, then the Arrow 3 system. And then if you get very close, within 40 to 70 kilometers, you have the Iron Dome. And if you escape all this and still hit, that tells you what kind of superior technology you have. That's what they did not contemplate or think that they may have. And when you go about this day after day after day, and you do all this devastation, Iran has the capacity, as the Palestinians and other Muslims, throughout, they have the capacity to endure pain. The Israelis don't have capacity. They didn't have their airport working, their seaport working, their industry that was called. They were spending 10, 12, 15 hours underground in there. They couldn't take that. They were ones who were actually crying to stop this.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that they would continue, but that's what was taking place at the time. So
I want to open it up.
Sure.
Two questions before we open it up. Number one is, the international system has, for the Americans, especially since after 1945, the international system was obviously designed, to try to preserve the status quo of the big powers, especially and preserve, Western hegemony in the world. The IAEA, which now there is reports that they were complicit in leaking where the facilities were and what
Scientists.
was and scientist information, and then not only that, no action has been done for the illegal actions that the United States and Israel have done now to attack a member that was under the protection of the IAEA agreement. The whole. Not only that, that's one aspect of the international architecture that has been completely delegitimized. Number two is the genocide in Gaza. The genocide is ongoing. Nothing has happened. The ICC, arrest warrants are issued. Nothing happens. So these wars that Israel has in this conflict that they have engaged in is almost, eating out the legitimacy and authority of the international system. And I wonder, why is that happening? And then number two is the failure of the Muslim world, and what path, I feel like the way that you have explained this is that there is a path for resistance, and there's a path to normalize and have a car and an iPhone, or I don't know what the dream is there. There's a choice now the Muslim world has to make about its own future. And I'd like to talk about the failure of the Muslim world and what to do next.
On the issue of the international system, I think one of the consequences of what happened since the genocide has been taking place now for 21 months is not only the failure, but the collapse of the whole system that's been managed primarily by the United States since World War II. We're talking about a complete collapse and
Violation of every humanitarian law.
Yeah, it's totally discredited, delegitimized. Just look at what the United States has been giving up. Even with Trump, he's trying not only to punish the judges who were supposedly independent and making independent judgments, and they have been doing this on different levels, particularly with African presidents, those who committed war crimes. Now he's trying to punish them because they indicted Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. They are trying to punish the International Court of Justice because they are looking into the issue of genocide with overwhelming evidence. They're trying to undermine the academic institutions in the U.S., universities, if people were voicing criticism or voicing opposition to
punish South Africa
genocide.
For bringing the case.
Yes, so this is all these institutions that we have been seeing, and of course, not to talk about vetoes that they have been casting. So this is undermining the whole system, which means eventually that you will have countries that can actually go outside that system that will do whatever they want. And
countries have to calculate now, right? That we now really do live in an international system that is anarchic.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
This is now a new security dilemma for every single country in the international order.
Right. Let's remember also that what happened with the U.S. attack on Iran was also a half-hearted effort to cover American weakness. Because for America to attack Iran fully, which has a tremendous amount of destructive force, Iran could not be pacified. They couldn't even defeat the Houthis. after a month, they had troops.
Yeah, ceasefire, yes.
So if they wanted to go after Iran, they would have to have employed perhaps tactical nuclear weapons if they want to get quick victory, which would have even undermined more the whole system. So they wanted to hit and call it victory. And I think when I go back and see the tit for tat between Iran and the United States, I see a bit of theater here. Because the Americans basically telegraphed the Iranians they're going to hit and that they have to take it. And if they don't respond strongly, that will be the end of it. And the Iranians did that. They just absorbed this without actually impacting the nuclear program fully. And in return, the Iranians said, we're going to hit some of your bases in Iraq and Qatar, because the largest American base outside America is in Qatar. But we're going to tell you exactly what we're going to do, how many missiles. So you have plenty of time to shoot them down or empty. So basically, it was a calculated thing between both sides, which basically says Trump can tell his donors and his Zionist supporters, I did something, and I finished the program, which he didn't.
Which didn't, yeah.
And the Iranians can say, we have the capability of hurt you, but we don't want confrontation.
Specialists are saying that it's only set back by months.
I mean, who knows? I mean, no one really knows, because no one went there and to examine whether the centrifuges have been hit or who knows. But the point here is that exposed the Israeli plan and made it, now they have to make a decision about whether they're going to continue their confrontation with Iran, in which there will be more devastating blows and missiles, because I don't think they can drag the US in a war. I think Trump did it and called it quits, and that means the United States now has realized that the limitations of their ability to stop Iran. That by itself gives us more into the future. That the future is not Israeli hegemony. So your question about the Muslim world and the Arab world is very pointed here. The Arab world and the Muslim world met twice before the latest meeting in Istanbul here. November 11th, 2023. A year later, November 11th, 2024. 57 countries. In both cases, they had one resolution. They couldn't agree on anything else, which is to allow massive aid into the Palestinians, not allow them to starve, not allow them to suffer. In both cases, they failed to implement that resolution. Thousands of trucks are outside, and they're unable to bring in one bottle of water to a thirsty child without Netanyahu saying so. That weakness is what invites and what makes the Israeli behavior arrogant in a way that they can impose their will.
That makes genocide possible.
That's what makes genocide possible, exactly. That's what makes it, makes them able to impose, they think, impose their will, and actually invites them to do more and more and more. Now, are the Muslim countries and Arab countries capable? Absolutely, they are capable. Just think about this. 2 months ago, less than 2 months ago, Trump came here. He was given trillions of dollars without any conditions from a handful of countries. Do you think had they said that these are our conditions to deliver on this, would have made? Yes, he would have, because he's transactional president. But they didn't use that.
Yeah, but that means that you would have a spirit of resistance. I mean, to use
or decency, just not allowing genocide to take place. You don't even have to resist. Just saying this is too much for our people. You know, our people are not taking it anymore. We can't have any kind of a peaceful coexistence with such savages that they are killing people, children and women and babies, and starving them. I mean, we went from just genocide into genocide and starvation. Hundreds of people. And then they come and say, we're going to give them aid, and then bring them aid, and then they bomb them while receiving the aid. I mean, there isn't a single war crime that hasn't been done, you know, in this. So this is what says now, on your final point about the future, and maybe we can end here, is where does this lead us? And I think after we saw what we saw, after we witnessed what we've witnessed, after we experienced what we've experienced, I think people should know now that Zionism has been exposed as a movement as a regime that is unwilling to actually coexist with any other people inside Palestine or any other power in the region, because they will all have to submit to this ideology. And if this idea was in doubt before, I think it should be very clear now. What they're doing in Lebanon, what they're doing in Syria, what they're doing in Palestine, certainly, what they're doing in Iran, they are willing to use whatever at their disposal to devastate the whole region, blow it up, wreck it. Their idea, their plan, is to divide Syria in four, to break up the country. They want to break up Iraq, break up Syria, break up Iran. By the way, the idea in Iran was to break it up along ethnic lines. They wanted, they want to empower different. Iran is made of 18 different ethnicities. They want to break it up. They broke up Sudan and still doing that. They have a hand in what's happening in Libya. The whole point is to break up this whole region. That's what Israel is working on. So the only solution towards that actually is to dismantle these Zionist structures. We're not talking about elimination of Jews or any of that nonsense. That's not what this is about. This is about a regime, this is about an ideology that is racist, supremacist, aggressive, colonial settler. They're trying to impose its will through all aggressive means to do this to the region. And therefore, we need to rethink this. This is not a Palestinian problem. See, I just want to tell you that back in 1937, Ben Gurion was having a visit in New York. And he was talking to Jewish leaders. And he was trying to convert them to Zionism. This document has been released recently, in which he says the success of Zionism is when we turn the Jewish question or the Jewish problem into an Arab problem. So it's no longer the world is seeing this as a Jewish problem. It's a Palestinian problem that needs to be solved. Not that the world had a Jewish problem because of Europe, of its racism and persecution of Jews. See, this is what he considered as the success of Zionism.
Wow.
So we should not look at this as a Palestinian problem. We should look at this as an Israeli Zionist problem that the whole world must get to resolve. And that's why everybody needs to get involved in this. It's as a problem for the Lebanese, for the Syrian, for the Jordanian, for the Saudi, for the Pakistani, for the Iranian, for the Egyptian, for the Turkish, for everyone in the world. Because this movement will not stop at anything except to be the hegemon, not just here, but across. And that's how it should be. So to do that, then, the goal should be to dismantle racist, supremacist, Zionist structures. That's when we can really have a peaceful coexistence among all the peoples in the region. And that's what everybody needs to do. And to do that, we have to understand and study the sources of strength and then try to deal with them as they are. So that is not a military problem. Yes, they use military means in order to pacify, neutralize, and kill whatever they want to use. But it is much more than that, because Zionist influence is becoming now a phenomena. But now people are waking up. I mean, look what's happened today in the United States. It's a huge difference, and that's because of October 7th. Their narrative no longer. Who believes the Zionist narrative now? Who believes that when you criticize Israel, this is anti-Semitic? Who subscribes to the idea that because of what happened to the Jews during Nazism, that they have rights in Palestine? Now the Palestinian narrative is the one that is being more accepted. In the latest poll in the United States, 56% of Americans today are sympathetic with the Palestinians, only 18% with Israelis. That never happened before. This is because of October 7th. So it's not just that we're saying these sacrifices of the Palestinians are not going in vain. For the first time, you have International Court of Justice that's going to rule that what's happening in Gaza is genocide because of Zionism, because of Israel. We have indictments. We have arrest warrants that's going against the Prime Minister of Israel. So whatever the Trump administration and others trying to do, this is not going to change these facts.
Okay, I want to open it up. If there's any other if there's any questions or points of clarification or ideas, the floor is yours.
What question related
repeat the
What you
question.
spoke of regarding the recent engagement between Iran and Israel, don't you think that it's more likely that the conflict will escalate further, or at least continue in its current rhythm, due to Netanyahu's very particular case in Israel that if he stops now, he's done for, at least internally. He can't afford to stop. He didn't achieve anything of what he declared that he wanted to, and that he's going to have to continue bombing Iran, but that he now has to continue bombing Gaza.
The question is that what is happening now? What is happening now is a way of saving Netanyahu's skin. If he doesn't continue the conflict perpetually, then he will have to face maybe corruption charges and being banned from politics in Israel.
Well, if you're following what Trump's trying to do this past week, was trying to address this issue, and he was calling on the Israelis to drop all these charges on Netanyahu, so that he is not hiding behind the wall, so that he can save his skin. Whether that succeeds or not, I don't know. But yes, that's one factor. But I think Netanyahu is also an ideologue, and he's trying to take advantage of what's happening now. He cannot do that with Iran, because Iran has demonstrated that it has the power to inflict major losses on Israel. It was the Israelis in the last few days of that 12-day war who were basically begging the Americans to get involved and stop this war and get a ceasefire. And of course, it's not in the interest of the Iranians also to continue this war, but they were willing to continue it if they had to. But when it comes to Gaza, they have different calculations. They want to depopulate, to expel the Palestinians. They want to end the resistance, but they haven't been able to do it. They haven't been able to achieve that. So it's not in the interest of the Americans to achieve these goals through a genocide. That's just bad for them. The images and what's happening. And Trump has been giving him all the time to do that. He came and said, "Give me a couple of months." 2 months came and gone. Give me another 2 months. For how long? He doesn't have much time to do his agenda. He has a long agenda, domestic and international. He cannot just give up his agenda because Netanyahu cannot end the war. So he's trying to achieve the end of what Netanyahu wants through political means rather than military means. So this is how the negotiations are taking place. So the Israelis have about 50 people, maybe 30 of them dead, maybe 20 living. These are military people. And of course, the resistance trying to do that as their only leverage to stop the war, stop the genocide, and to free as many Palestinians from the Israeli prisons as possible. Now, Netanyahu wants to free these and continue his war because his goal is to expel the Palestinians. He made Gaza totally unlivable.
And this isn't just a political trick to safeguard his prime ministership.
No.
This is part of a larger...
Yes.
Yeah.
But of course, now he wants to say that because he wants to go for re-election at this time where he's declaring victory over Iran, they convinced the Israeli public that they were able to finish off the Iranian nuclear program,
nuclear threat,
and that they have killed dozens of Iranian scientists and military leaders, and therefore we have victory. And therefore, he can go to the elections and win the elections, right? And that we have also won against Hezbollah. We have
defeated Hamas.
They cannot say defeated Hamas because
the hostages,
but at least they are on the run. We can eventually do that, and that we've changed Syria, and we actually may even have a peace treaty with Syria, and without even giving up the Golan Heights. So all this is an image of victory. So he's trying to project that. Whether he's successful or not, that's a different story. But that's what he's arguing. Now, in order to achieve this, Trump is playing along.
But close watchers of the scenario will never buy that because Iran, we don't know about the nuclear program like you mentioned. Iran still has the capability that has the missiles program. Hamas is still resisting. Even Syria, it's not a done, open and shut case. Things could change very quickly in Syria.
Well, they're trying. So this is where we need to understand the differences between Netanyahu's priorities and Trump's priorities. Trump wants to get a peace Nobel Prize. And to do that, he wants to expand the Abrahamic Accords. He's trying to get Syria as part of it, so that to open up, what is called reconstruction and money and banks and SWIFT and all that. He wants to bring Saudi Arabia to this. He can't bring Saudi Arabia with genocide going on. And eventually he wants to bring Pakistan and Indonesia and say, we're having peace now. And at the same time, he's trying to isolate Hamas. So he's trying to convince the Israelis to accept some sort of a ceasefire in which he can make this.
And this is essential to pivot to Asia. I mean, how can the Americans pivot to Asia and focus on China without, closing the chapter on all of this
That
resistance?
tells you about the power of the Zionist lobby and the Zionist insiders inside the administration. You're absolutely right, because this is contrary to what American interest is.
Yeah, of course.
They're taking resources. And by the way, one reason that they brought in all these aircraft carriers to hit Iran were coming from Asia.
Yeah,
and
they had
people
to
say,
divert.
what are you doing? And much of that ammunition they were using in order to intercept missiles from Iran, if China tomorrow goes and invades Taiwan, they don't have anything.
And they just said that they couldn't replenish the Arrow 3 missiles.
And the THAAD missiles.
And the THAAD missiles, the stockpiles have run out.
Yeah.
There was just a report out yesterday that the Americans had run out of certain, I think, specialized missiles. There's another question.
Okay, I just want to end
Yeah.
about this. So he wants to have greater Israel. He wants to keep his coalition and definitely not to go to prison. So that all is in play. At the same time, the Americans are trying to get what he wants politically and through normalization. These kind of decisions will be made this week when they meet in Washington and see who prevails.
They're all subtle.
Yeah, same objectives, yes.
Yes.
When would you say it became clear that the larger project from the Israeli perspective is the greater Israel project? And when do you think it became clear to a majority of people looking at the story in Palestine?
Can I repeat that question?
Because we look at the question of like India's idea of expansion as well, and there's a lot of refusal to think that Indian government and the Hindutva ideology has this expansionist perspective and project. And so the way Israel marketed itself, especially in the beginning, to other countries around the world, talking about the kibbutzes and the socialism and all of that, they kind of like concealed that aspect of their Zionism to some extent. So when did it become clear in your mind that if you think all Palestinians have understood it for the longest time, or it's also two Palestinians that they've seen it only now?
Okay.
So our esteemed guest wants to get clarity around what, in your estimation, when was the tipping point from when the project of Greater Israel became manifest? Because at some point, this was concealed as a strategy, and then at some point it became obvious. So, given the fact that there's other theaters in which expansionist policies of the same kind, that means land settlement and occupation, is happening, maybe this could be a lesson for others to pay close attention to.
I think the project of Greater Israel was always there. It was never left behind since Ben Gurion, since the establishment of the state. So any notion that somehow Israel was willing to concede any kind of land or not have an expansive settlement policy is just a myth. It's not true. You go back and examine all the policies, particularly after 1967, the first settlement took place shortly after 1967 war inside the West Bank. In 1971, there was this Alone plan in which they were going to populate most of these settlements. Even when Oslo was signed in 1993, the whole philosophy, the whole underpinning idea of Oslo was that the Palestinians will recognize Israel on 78% of Palestinian land, In return, 22% would be a Palestinian state, even truncated or even demilitarized or, losing sovereignty, whatever. It was something that would have been considered as a Palestinian state.
So this is a pre-1948
Oh yes.
issue.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, they never recognized. There's no. These are our borders. No, there's nothing. It's whatever our last soldier is. That's our border until the next battle. So, in Oslo, there was this historic agreement, right? And the whole world said, okay, now we're going to have a two-state solution. Even the Palestinians, in the name of the PLO, has signed up to this. So the number of settlers on the eve of the Oslo Accords were 125,000. Today it's 800,000. So since when did they abandon the Greater Israel? If all what you're doing is expanding, 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 under all administrations, there isn't a single government in Israel that did not expand, whether it was Labour, whether it was Likud, whether it was Olmert, with Sharon, whether it was with whoever was in charge, Bennett, whatever. They always were expanding, and always under different pretexts.
So it was a pre-1948 misconception then.
I mean,
at some point, the people who allowed for these immigrations to take place and then settlers to come, like the kibbutz that he's talking about, at some point, they didn't see them as an existential threat.
Who didn't see them?
I mean, the people living in that land.
Palestinians.
Palestinians.
Well, I mean,
and then at some point, they realized that this whole project is...
No, that realization was very early.
Like when was that?
It was when Herbert Samuel became the High Commissioner. So what happened is that in 1917, Limby occupied Palestine, December 1917. 1918, now you have a British occupation with Herbert Samuel was a Zionist, Jewish Zionist person. He was the High Commissioner. And again, they had the Balfour Declaration a year before. Mm-hmm. So they started setting up how they're going to transfer land and allow immigration. By 1920, they get, in the League of Nations, they get mandate. Then they institute policies. For example, this is a myth that the Palestinians were selling their land. How many people heard that?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so what is the fact? The facts are that Palestine did not have the same structure as it ended up under the British mandate. Under the Ottomans, it was north-south. So the north of Palestine was under the province of Beirut.
Yes.
That part, the tax collectors of the Ottomans were from today's Lebanese. Two families in particular, Al-Sursu, who are Maronites, and Al-Salam, who are Sunnis, in which their descendant today is the prime minister in Lebanon. One had 400,000 acres, and one actually dunums, which is, each 4 dunums is 1 acre, and one had 600,000. They sold, they're not even part of that. No, but they sell, but what happened is that the peasants, the farmers, they still farm the land. Because it's the system, if you farm the land.
It's tax farming.
So when the British took over, they allowed that system to continue. They would not collect taxes. They will leave you 4, 5, 6 years. They will come and say, here's a tax bill.
The peasants is...
they can't. So they take them out. They approve them. And they give them to the... So you will have British soldiers. No, you have Palestinian soldiers working for the British trying to approve these. And if they cannot, they have behind them British soldiers. And behind them, the Jewish agency with their tractors paying the tax bill and take over the land. They get gifts and grants from the British. And few that sold. This whole structure, in 30 years, from 1918 until 1948, the total land under the possession of the Jewish agency was 6.5%, according to the United Nations when they sent surveys.
So even with all of that, they only got
6.5%. So when they took over in May 1948, when they started their expansion, all what they controlled was 6.5%. By the end of the war, it became 55%. By the start of the war, 55%, because this is what they were aiming at. By the summer of 1949, it was 78%. By 1967, 100%.
So very rapidly, they
were preparing for this day. They were having, they had, see, this is, we defeated 7 Arab armies.
So that's very scary. So if we're in a situation where settlers come in and they only get less than 5% of the land,
Yeah.
as long as this intention and this planning is there and there's coordination, almost overnight,
If you have that,
could,
of course.
things could go from 5%,
0 to 100.
0 to 100.
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. And that's what they have, the intention. I mean,
Yeah.
now we have all these details. You can read Ilan Pappé's books, like The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. He talks about this, Plan Dalit, which means Plan D.
Plan?
Dalit. Dalit is, in Hebrew, is D in English. Okay, Plan Dalit is Plan D.
Plan D.
So they have A, B, C, D. D is to depopulate the Palestinians from their villages by committing massacres, by committing all kinds of things in order to take over the land. And that's exactly what they were doing. 80% of the Palestinians in the 78% land that they occupied in 1948 were expelled. 80%, that's, I mean, just imagine if you have a country where 80% of the people are expelled in a matter of months. I mean, that's why it's called the Nakba.
Okay.
So from that moment on, they had this all along. It was coming in and out. Now, somebody like
and
Netanyahu,
Palestinians knew that from 1917, 1918.
now, of course, I mean, if you look at Palestinian resistance, they have intifadas, 1921, 1929. Then they have the Al-Qassam resistance in 1935. He's killed in November. Then you have the largest strike in history of mankind. 3 years, from 36 to 39 until the World War II. The whole country is shut down. Just imagine the whole country is shut down for 3 years. And they were begging. They came with the white paper, the English, because they could not pacify the Palestinians. They said, okay, we're going to limit immigration of Jews. They will no longer be allowed. That's where they start having this friction. They shut down completely the country for 3 years. And then you have World War II coming in.
So the Palestinians from very early on knew that this was a settler colonial project.
It was, and they tried, but of course, I mean, there's many reasons why they're not successful. Because the other ones, they came with a military plan. These are able-bodied, who are trained. And then during World War II, they have the Jewish Legion. And they were trained and they had arms. So they have 60,000 soldiers in May 1948 when they started expanding. So we defeated 7 Arab armies. The whole Arab armies, all 7 of them, did not exceed 30,000. And some of them were ragtag. 12,000 came from Egypt. Didn't even come to 30,000. And who was leading the Jordanian army? British. So a British general.
Okay. We have to end.
I mean, Globe Basher. I mean, just imagine these are, and they were of course making side deals. The Jordanians with the king of Jordan at the time, or the Emir of Jordan. He was making side deals with the Israelis. And then the Egyptians were under, they bought some arms. And of course, these arms were not functioning, and you have all these kind of things. My father, for example, was fighting with a group called the Jihad al-Muqaddas, which is the Palestinian-born group. To buy a rifle, it was 2,000 pounds, which is huge. I mean, who would own that? And if you're caught by the British with a bullet or a rifle, the punishment was death on sight. Death on sight. It's not even, there's no trial. If you're caught with a thing, you'll be killed on sight. So this is monumental, this is trying to defend, and these are the challenges that you're facing.
I wish we could continue the conversation, but we're already over time. I thank all the people who have joined us online in the live streaming and also the participants here. Please stay tuned for our next webinar. We usually have them every month. And for everybody else, I hope to see you next time. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.